Spiritual Identity, authored and narrated by Dr. Merle Ray. Lesson 6, Careful Who You Call Hootchie. Going from Hootchie to holy isn't for the younger women or those of low socioeconomic status or women outside the church. It's not even for women only. It's actually for the church. In the 1950s, legendary father of Chicago blues, Muddy Waters, the Hoochie Coochie Man, enthused both black and white audiences, cultures from Mississippi to England with this term, Hoochie. It allowed his music to cross over from blues to rock and roll and even jazz genres before finally giving birth to the Hoochie Mama in recent years. Although the word has resurfaced in urban culture and R&B and hip-hop music, the Hoochie has actually been around for a long time. She existed as far back as the Bible days. She just wasn't called a Hoochie back then. She was a harlot, or called a whore. A woman was referred to as one of these when she rejected the authority of her father's house and instead chose to depend on getting her needs met through her own tactics, primarily her body, to get her needs and wants met. There's a strange thing about hoochies. They have a unique way of wearing clothing or the lack thereof. Hoochies believe that they can make any piece of clothing look good on them. Of all the different pieces of clothing they wear, it's the clothing that you don't see that speaks the loudest. Ironically, the most worn item of clothing for a hoochie is favored also among brides. It's an invisible veil that speaks the most for a hoochie. It makes her beauty it masks her beauty within and mutilates her beauty without, leaving her with scars for a lifetime. I used to hide behind many veils. As soon as I would take off one, another would be in its place. I was ashamed of my past and too afraid of my future because of all the mistakes I had made. Some of them weren't even my mistakes. They belonged to others that hurt me. Nevertheless, they still caused me great shame and pain. I was a woman who had been taught the right behaviors, who was born and bred in the church, respectful to my parents and teachers, making good grades, and a leader at home and school. From the age of 12, I was assigned to teach Sunday school to other children. Outside of the church, I was an honor student in the top 10% of my class and was decorated with academic medals and awards from first grade. Yet I was totally distraught by the age of 22. I was unfulfilled and looking for love in all the wrong places. I came from a family of warm, loving women who were badly abused as young women and were raised with no self-esteem. As adults, they had no training or nurturing to compensate for what they didn't get as children. Wearing a lot of veils, I forewent to college at first and married right out of high school, thinking I was doing the right thing. Naivety and domestic violence made me a divorced parent by the age of 21. An overachiever, I excelled at work, receiving one promotion after another while going to college at night. Along the way, I became many great roles in corporate America. Everyone knew me as a great leader on the job, but I was a wreck at home. I wouldn't even come home until long after happy hour, leaving my daughter cared for by my live-in sister. I was never into drugs or excessive alcohol. I was simply busy caring for those veils, trying to get the love and abandonment issues of my childhood resolved. My earliest childhood memory, is of the night when I overheard my mother say she was going to kill my father. He had been out for several days at a time with other women who we all knew well because we lived in a small town. My mother told us to go to bed, and I remember thinking I would never see my father again. He was my favorite parent, and I didn't know why. I seemed to have no issues with my father. I couldn't figure out why my mother had plenty. When I was 4 years old, my father left my mother, my two sisters, and I. A fourth sister was on the way. I still remember the day my mother went into labor having my baby sister. My dad had left us in Louisiana, and I would not see him again until many, many years later when I was a teenager. In a single parent home, we were extremely poor. However, I never remember us receiving food stamps or welfare assistance. Instead, my mother always worked hard labor under the most horrid conditions I'd ever seen. She worked in a chicken processing plant where live chickens were killed on the spot while water, blood, and guts were splattered all over the workers' plastic aprons before the fowls were eventually shipped out to grocery stores. People always brought us food, and I cannot ever recall being hungry as a child. I do remember not having much, but it was always enough. The thing I feared most was going to bed at night because for some reason I was afraid I would die. I used to stay awake as long as I could because I didn't want to close my eyes for fear of death. I don't know if it had anything to do with the fear of losing my father that night that my mother threatened to kill him, but all I know is that all of my life, until I was 18 years old, my greatest wish was to have my father back. Even though my mother found a new husband several years later, it seemed as if I'd never recovered from missing my father. There was one moment in my life as an adolescent that has been the highlight of my entire childhood, and that was when my father's mother passed away. My father came to her funeral, and I got to spend a few hours with him. Though it was the second saddest day of my childhood because I lost my favorite grandmother at the time, it was the happiest day of my childhood because I got to see my father again. We went to church a lot during my childhood, and I was practically born in church, but all I knew of God was that he was the one who would punish or kill you if you did not pray a lot or if you did too many wrong things. I tried to be the best little girl I could be because I didn't want to die. By the time I was a teenager, I was so tired of being afraid to go to sleep at night that I was miserable. I began to wonder if I would be better off dead anyway. I never told anyone, not even my best friend Rose, but there were times when I thought about what life would be like if I was not around. My issue in the end was that I was always too afraid of even the thought of hurting myself, so suicide was out. Because of marital problems between my mom and my stepfather, I ended up leaving home while still in high school and marrying immediately after graduation. We immediately got pregnant, and when my daughter was just 3 years old, I left my first husband because he had become very violent, and I started out as a single mother when I was 21. After many years of trying to find the love I missed as a child inside of nightclubs and nightclub owners, I found myself even deeper in depression by the age of 30. Yet I was still making a lot of money being promoted in corporate America with Houston's largest employers, still going to college, and still appearing to be successful on the outside. proof that not all hoochies are poor and uneducated. I met a man in a club, and he didn't look like he belonged there. He seemed like a nice man, and we became friends. He introduced me to his pastor and his pastor's wife, and that was the beginning of my new life. They introduced me to the Jesus that I had taught others about, and for the first time in my life, I accepted the gospel of grace for the condition I was in. And even after finding out that Christ accepted me just as I was, despite my past mistakes, I continued to struggle, especially in relationships, because I was still trying to figure out the answer to the same question my daughter was now asking me. Mom, what makes a good woman? I had accepted Christ as Lord, but I didn't know he was also a lover. I married a second time to a preacher and spent thousands to have the wedding, only to be divorced in less than 6 months. It took me 6 years to pay off the wedding. I thought that was the first time in my life that I'd met a man who seemed even more desperate than I was. However, that just shows how desperate I really was. The third time I married, it was to the friend that I'd met in the club, through whom I'd been introduced to the person of Jesus Christ. But because of my friend's addiction, we were divorced after 7 years. Then, because of his sobriety, we were remarried 12 years later. Altogether, between his addiction issues and my identity issues, we have married each other 3 times, hoping to get it right and become a godly example of what to do, or rather what not to do, with issues of identity and self-worth. I was married so many times it became a family tradition. 3 times married to the same man and 2 times married to different men means I've been married 5 times. That's a lot of veils. That's like the woman from the Bible who Jesus met at the well. I learned through all my dramas and traumas that, single or married, God has already divinely ordained identity, love, and fulfillment in our favor. These are not things outside of us, but on the inside. We're just terribly unprepared for the individual and corporate struggles we have to overcome every day just to enjoy them. From birth, women are not shown how to tap into the love of God. We then begin a lifetime of cheating ourselves, and all the more cheating others. When other people see this type of behavior in females, they usually call her a skank or a hoochie. But God, he's the one who calls her holy. Brides and women of Eastern culture aren't the only ones who wear veils to cover themselves. Hoochies, rich or poor, wear veils too. They cover their shame, pride, or even apathetic ignorance. They cover all the ways in which they themselves and others cheat them out of the truth about their lives. They are not all poor and uneducated. They are just untrained. By my definition, a hoochie is a woman in spiritual identity crisis. They all wear facades. Most of them, like me, want to take off their veils, but they don't know how. And other women make us feel too ashamed or too angry that we can't get them off. So instead, we hide behind the veils of men, money, careers, children, the high life or the low life. We become either too prideful or too shameful to remove them. Either way, we are raped of our self-worth. In her book, Life is Not a Fairy Tale, Fantasia Barrino describes her own impressions of hoochies. I commend her for encouraging younger women not to become hoochies, but I feel the need to encourage all women Fantasia described a woman of faith who helped her find true identity beyond the fairy tale. For many others, finding women of faith to coach them through identity, love, and fulfillment challenges is a real problem. In my own observation, churches are filled with women who appear to be in spiritual identity crisis themselves. I say this because many appear to be unapproachable. They don't seem to be fulfilled or passionate about life, and they seek to be accepted into the cliques or social clubs of life as their source of passion. While when talking about hoochies, the word whore first occurs in the Bible in Leviticus 19, verse 29. Interestingly, God is not talking to daughters, but to fathers in this passage. He says, "Do not prostitute thy daughter to cause her to be a whore, lest the land fall to whoredom and the land become full of wickedness." God was saying that under no circumstances were fathers to ever cause their daughters to need to use their bodies for provision. It is obvious that he was speaking to the role of fathers in providing for their families and homeland. A father who will not take care of his own household is an infidel, says the Bible in 1 Timothy 1 and 8. Proves him a faithless man, but that's a whole nother story. Since God spoke to the term whore, or spoke of this term whore as evil, it is sad to see so many females today boasting using this word, words like the bees and the whores and the hoochies so proudly. What they may really want from their relationships is value, worth, protection, security, wedding rings, and commitment. Instead, the only rings they have are those displayed prominently as children, circling from one end of their dress tails to the other. Statistics say that this situation will only get worse without intervention. According to the 2000 U.S. Census Bureau, there were more than 1.4 million young people between the ages of 16 and 19 who are not in school and not working. Imagine all of the entire number of households in Houston, Texas, at that time, the fourth largest city in the United States. That's how many teenagers there were that were not in school and not working in the United States in the year 2000. One can only guess what they were doing. Without our intervention, what else can we expect? Being in identity crisis is not a crime. The crime is not getting free. Hoochies aren't determined by age or where they live or what race or identity they are. They are not even determined by their income or how much money they make. When a woman of any age, status, or position doesn't embrace God as her father, she is instead attached to something else, even her own reputation. She looks for someone or something that can touch, pamper, and give her identity and value. On the big screen and off, in affluent neighborhoods and ghettos, you find hoochies from all walks of life. Again, being in identity crisis is not a crime. The crime is in not wanting to get free. Hoochies come in all colors, shapes, and sizes. Hoochies use work, religion, or anything to cover up insecurity. Both men and women alike can act like hoochies because they cover up fear and insecurity. Some even do great work and commit to great causes, but they promote themselves by not trusting God. This is the way of the spiritual Hootchie. She doesn't know she's missing something internally. She thinks she already has God by virtue of having his blessings in her life. The problem occurs when she doesn't rely on God to get her needs met, her problems resolved, and her issues met. Instead, she thinks these blessings are from her own personal effort. These are the real Hoochies in God's sight. They use anything, including work, sex, popularity, money, power, or religion, for their own personal ambition, fulfillment, or security in life. Instead of letting God feel their deep personal desires for identity, security, success, and emotional intelligence, they do it their way. They don't yield to God as the author and source of every good and perfect gift. God wants us to heal, all of us, from all of our issues, whatever the issues are. They are all spiritual wounds. Hardcore Hoochies are rich and poor. They do not embrace loving God. They wear even greater facades than the young girls living in the fast lanes of life. Instead of children around their waists, spiritual Hoochies wear a number of things. They wear religion and self-defeating attitudes. They wear fantasy, disorientation, and control. Hardcore spiritual Hoochies don't want to change. These are the real Hoochies, not the poor half-dressed girls you see on the street. The difference between the two is one word: hope. The real Hoochies are those who refuse to allow God to love on them. They might even say they know who he is, but they're not willing to apply his truth to their issues and situations. They'd rather choose their own way of being right, getting their own needs met. They even choose their own way of getting what they want, like getting their own man by compromising or taking someone else's. Some spiritual Hoochies even use God's name or places of worship to do it. These are they who have given up on God for the issues of their heart. Instead, they have become unfaithful to the God they say must exist. Yet they have chosen someone or something else to put their hope in. There are also Hoochies who don't claim to know God, and they want to stay that way. They have settled for lies about God rather than wanting to open their hearts to him themselves. They would rather not experience him for themselves. Their hearts have become cold, and they like their evil ways. Indeed, spiritual identity crisis does not limit itself to the poor woman who gives her body away to survive. Jesus himself said that this kind of woman could be accepted into his kingdom before anyone who exalts her heart against God. Rahab, Mary Magdalene, the woman at the well, and the woman caught in adultery are all examples of women in the Bible who were considered Hoochies of the day. Yet Jesus warmly welcomed them into his circle of influence. How could Jesus himself accept such women openly? Because God has a wider definition of womanhood. These women found the key to winning the heart of God. They learned the kingdom of God is wherever the king reigns. They knew the first move one makes in the presence of a king is to acknowledge that he is the king. The woman who bows to her own standard of right identity will never be right in the presence of the king. Because of the way I carried myself, no one would have ever called me a hoochie. I was college educated, highly compensated, a leader in the church and community. I didn't have many men. I was only interested in a serious, long-term relationship with one man. I looked like the woman who had it all. No one would have ever suspected me of having a heart that was turned against God. Relying on my own thoughts and tactics for getting my identity needs met made me no different than a hoochie. She exists at all levels of society, even affluent ones. She is not the woman or girl with the birth control issues we've all heard about. I would venture to say that if the girl or woman we all call hoochie was nurtured from birth to experience the King, the lover, God, the Creator, then she would not be called hoochie at all, but holy.